The prairie night was cold, silent, and merciless. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind swept through the tall grass like whispers carrying secrets too heavy to bear. Beneath that vast and indifferent sky, a child had been left alone, a tiny girl with nothing but the stars for company and the ache of abandonment pressing against her fragile chest. Her cries were thin, swallowed quickly by the endless darkness, as if the land itself refused to comfort her. In the Old West, many were forgotten, but a child left to the wild was a wound the earth seemed unwilling to heal. It was there, in that cruel silence, that a widow woman stumbled upon her. A woman who herself had known the sharp sting of loss, who carried grief like a shadow that never loosened its grip. She had buried her husband years before, and her home had grown quiet, haunted by absence. Yet when her eyes fell upon the trembling girl, something deeper stirred, an ache she thought had long been buried, but which now rose with the strength of a storm. She knelt beside the child, her rough hands trembling as they brushed dirt from the girl's face. The little one's eyes, wide and fearful, met hers, and in that fragile gaze was a question no words could form. Why was I left? The widow's heart, scarred by sorrow yet still beating with untold tenderness, broke open at the sight. Her voice cracked through the night, not loud, not commanding, but soft enough to steady the child's tears. "Don't cry," she whispered, her breath warm against the girl's ear. "You're safe now." That promise, spoken under the indifferent stars, carried more weight than any oath sworn in daylight. It was not just comfort, it was defiance. In a land that consumed the weak and rewarded only the ruthless, those words became a shield, fragile but unyielding. The girl clung to them as if they were the only truth left in the world. And for the widow, they became more than a vow. They became purpose, the reason to rise each morning, to keep fighting against the loneliness that had nearly swallowed her whole. From that night on, their fates were bound. The little girl, abandoned to die, and the widow, abandoned to grief, had found one another in the most unlikely of places. And as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, the land seemed to bear silent witness to their union, a promise that in the Old West, where cruelty often reigned, compassion still had the power to carve a story strong enough to endure. The widow brought the little girl back to her modest cabin at the edge of town, a place weathered by years of storms and silence. The house, once built for a family, had long echoed with emptiness, its walls carrying the memory of laughter now gone. As she set the child inside, laying her on a rough wool blanket, the air seemed to shift. What had been hollow and heavy now felt warmer, as if the small figure had lit a flame against the cold weight of grief. The widow's heart, long accustomed to carrying sorrow alone, found itself trembling with something unfamiliar: hope. The girl, though frail, clung to life with a quiet strength. Her cheeks, smudged with dirt, flushed faintly in the glow of the fire. She looked around with wide, searching eyes, her silence louder than cries could ever be. The widow studied her closely, recognizing in that gaze a reflection of her own pain, the raw wound of being left behind. She pressed bread softened in milk to the child's lips, watching as she ate slowly, as though afraid it might be taken away. And with each bite, the widow's resolve deepened. This child would not know abandonment again. Outside, whispers began to stir in town. News of the widow finding the abandoned baby spread quickly, carried on wagons and over fences. Some called it charity, others foolishness. In the Old West, mouths were quick to judge and slow to help. Neighbors speculated about the girl's parentage, wondering what kind of family would leave an infant to die in the dust. Some muttered it was a curse, while others shook their heads with pity, claiming the widow was too old and too broken to raise a child. Yet she ignored them all, her heart set firmly on the vow she had made under the stars. Nights in the prairie were unforgiving, but the widow now had a reason to face them with courage. She would wake at the smallest whimper, rocking the girl against her chest, whispering the same words she had spoken that first night: "You're safe now." Each repetition stitched a bond between them, stronger than blood, stronger even than fear. In those fragile hours, she found healing not just for the girl, but for herself. The ache of her husband's absence eased, not gone but softened by the presence of new life that demanded her love. By the end of the week, the girl's laughter began to fill the cabin, a sound so unexpected it brought tears to the widow's eyes. She had thought her home would remain forever silent, but now it carried the voice of someone who had been cast aside, yet refused to fade. The widow realized then that destiny in the Old West did not always ride in on horseback or roar with thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of a child's hand gripping yours, asking for nothing more than the promise to stay. The bond between the widow and the girl grew quickly, but so too did the scrutiny from those around them. Townsfolk whispered louder now, some with suspicion, others with jealousy. In a place where survival meant keeping your own kin alive, the idea of taking in another's abandoned child seemed reckless. Men at the saloon muttered that she was a fool, wasting her few resources on a girl who wasn't her blood. Women shook their heads, pitying her for shouldering a burden when she could have remained alone. Yet, for all their talk, none dared to look her in the eye when she walked past. The quiet strength in her step made their words falter. The girl, still too young to speak much, clung to the widow's skirts whenever strangers appeared. Her small hands, scarred by neglect, now sought comfort in the touch of the only person who had not left her behind. At night, she began to whisper her first words, broken, trembling sounds, but one phrase came clear: safe now. The widow wept the first time she heard it, knowing that the word she had spoken as a promise had now become the child's truth. It was no longer just comfort, it was identity. But the prairie did not allow peace to settle for long. One afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of the widow's land, watching with eyes sharp and unforgiving. Rumors had said the girl's father was a drifter, a man who cared little for his child. Yet men like him often returned when they smelled opportunity. The widow felt the weight of his stare before he turned his horse and rode off without a word. That night, her sleep was restless, haunted by the fear that the past the girl had escaped might come clawing back to claim her. The elders of the nearby settlement noticed as well. They had seen the girl's resilience, the way her spirit seemed stronger than her small body could contain. One evening, an older woman approached the widow, offering herbs for strength and a carved charm meant to ward off evil. She said little, but her eyes carried the weight of understanding, both of grief and of love that was chosen rather than given by blood. The widow accepted, humbled, realizing that some bonds could only be understood by those who had also walked through loss. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between widow and child became unshakable. The cabin no longer echoed with sorrow, but with life. The girl's laughter grew stronger, her steps more confident, her trust in the widow absolute. Yet beneath that joy, the widow knew the truth. In the Old West, nothing remained untouched by struggle. The day would come when she would have to protect the girl not just from hunger or cold, but from those who saw kindness as weakness and compassion as a threat. And when that day arrived, she would stand firm, just as she had the night she whispered, "Don't cry. You're safe now." The seasons turned, and with them the widow's life took on a rhythm she had never expected. Each morning she rose before dawn, tending to the fire while the girl slept curled beneath a quilt she had stitched by hand. Her days, once heavy with silence, were now filled with small footsteps, curious questions, and laughter that seemed to breathe warmth back into the wooden walls of her cabin. The child was growing, not just in size but in spirit, and with every day that passed, she became less the girl who had been abandoned and more the daughter the widow had chosen. But as the girl's smile grew brighter, so too did the shadows beyond their home. The memory of that lone rider still lingered in the widow's mind. She knew men like him, drifters who had no place they called home, no ties they honored. Men who looked at a child not with love, but with possession, as though she were nothing more than a burden to cast off or a token to reclaim when pride demanded it. The widow began watching the horizon more carefully, her hand often resting near the rifle above the hearth. Love had made her strong, but it had also made her vigilant. The town, divided as always, found itself drawn into the story. Some softened at the sight of the widow walking with the child at her side, seeing in it a rare example of grace in a place ruled by survival. Others remained bitter, muttering that no woman should tie herself to another's mistakes. Still, whether in admiration or contempt, all eyes seemed to follow them. The child had become a symbol, of shame to some, of hope to others. And the widow carried that weight without faltering, because she knew the girl's worth was not for the world to decide. One evening, as the sun bled across the prairie, the girl tugged at the widow's hand and asked the question she had long feared. "Why did they leave me?" The words pierced like a blade, heavy with innocence yet soaked in sorrow. The widow knelt, her eyes burning with tears she had tried to hide, and pulled the child close. "Some hearts are too weak to hold love," she whispered, "but mine is not. And you were never meant to be lost. You were meant to be found." In that moment, the girl's tears softened into silence, and the widow knew the truth. Sometimes love is not inherited. It is chosen in the face of pain. That night, as coyotes howled in the distance, the widow lay awake with the child sleeping soundly beside her. She realized that fate had given her a second chance, not to erase her own grief, but to transform it into something stronger. The girl was no longer a wound in the story of the West. She was its redemption, proof that even in a land hardened by cruelty, tenderness could still take root. The widow swore to herself that whatever shadows came, whatever storms threatened, she would not let them take this child away. The shadows arrived sooner than she expected. Weeks later, as the wind carried the bite of winter across the plains, riders appeared again at the edge of her land. This time there were three, their silhouettes dark against the snow-dusted horizon. The widow's heart tightened as she recognized the first among them, the same drifter who had once watched in silence. His return was no accident. He had come with intent, and the men at his side bore the same hungry look, the kind that sought to claim what they did not deserve. They dismounted slowly, their boots crunching against the frozen earth. The girl, sensing something was wrong, clung to the widow's hand, her small body trembling. The drifter's voice broke the still air, harsh and bitter. "That girl's mine. Blood don't lie." His words dripped with authority, but his eyes betrayed something else: desperation, greed, perhaps even shame. The widow stood firm, her rifle resting in her grip, though her hands did not tremble. She met his gaze with a steel that only years of loss could forge. "You gave up that right the day you left her to die," she said, her voice low but unyielding. The men at his side shifted, uncomfortable beneath her glare. They had expected weakness, an old woman too weary to fight. Instead, they found a widow carved by grief into something immovable, a force no less dangerous than the prairie storms. The girl hid behind her skirts, her eyes wide but her faith unshaken. She remembered the words whispered to her in the dark, "You're safe now." And even in her fear, she believed them. The standoff stretched long, the wind cutting through the silence like a blade. The drifter spat into the dirt, his pride wounded by her defiance. Yet he did not step forward. Perhaps it was the sight of the rifle, or the way the land seemed to stand behind her, vast and unyielding. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that the girl no longer looked at him with recognition or need, but only with fear. Whatever it was, he turned with a curse, mounting his horse with the others and riding back into the distance. But his eyes lingered, promising that the matter was not over. When the silence returned, the widow pulled the girl close, her heart pounding. She knew this was only the beginning, that the West would not so easily let them hold on to peace. But as she looked into the child's face, she also knew this. The bond they shared was worth every battle, every risk, every shadow that might rise. For in the Old West, where lives were often forgotten in dust and blood, she and the girl had carved a story too strong to be erased. The widow knew that peace would not last. The drifter's eyes, cold and bitter, had promised return, and promises in the West were rarely broken. Each morning she woke before dawn, scanning the horizon for riders, every sound of hooves making her grip the rifle tighter. Yet in the midst of this fear, the girl continued to grow, her laughter carrying through the cabin, her small hands helping with chores, her presence filling the spaces grief had carved hollow. To the widow, each day with the child was both a gift and a test, a reminder that love in the Old West was never free. It always demanded the courage to protect it. The townsfolk continued their whispers. Some admired the widow's strength in defying the drifter, though few said it aloud. Others predicted doom, claiming no woman could stand against men who lived by cruelty. A few even questioned whether she was keeping the girl out of pride rather than love. But the widow ignored their words. She had no time for gossip. Her only concern was keeping the girl safe. Still, she could feel the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides, as if the town itself were waiting for her to fail. The girl, unaware of the full danger, began to cling more fiercely to the widow's presence. She followed her everywhere, into the fields, to the well, even to the edge of town. Her small voice would ask the same question again and again. Am I safe? And each time, the widow would kneel, hold her close, and whisper, Yes, you are safe. Always. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the girl was asleep, the widow wondered if those words were strong enough to hold back the storm that was surely coming. Then one evening, a sign appeared. A knife, buried deep into the wood of her cabin's door, its handle wrapped with a strip of leather marked by a symbol she did not recognize. It was not the work of children playing tricks, nor of strangers passing through. It was a message, sharp and deliberate. The drifter had not forgotten. He had not given up. The widow's heart pounded, but she did not show fear. She pulled the knife free, placed it on the table, and sat in silence while the fire cracked. She knew the time was nearing when whispers and threats would turn into action. And yet, beneath the fear, there was resolve. She looked at the girl, sleeping peacefully in the corner, wrapped in the quilt she had sewn, and her decision hardened like steel. If the drifter returned, if he came with fire and fury, he would not find a grieving widow to be broken. He would find a mother forged by loss and love, ready to stand against whatever the prairie dared to send her way. For this child was not a burden, nor a mistake left behind. She was her daughter now, and no man would take her away. The drifter's return came under the cover of darkness, weeks later, when the prairie was cloaked in silence and the moon hung low and pale. This time he did not come alone. 4 men rode with him, their torches lighting up the night like angry stars. The thunder of hooves shook the ground as they circled the widow's land, their voices sharp with threats, their laughter cruel. The girl woke with a start, clutching the widow's arm, her wide eyes glistening with terror. The widow pulled her close, her heart steady even as her hands shook. The moment she had feared had come. The men demanded she hand the child over, their voices cutting through the night. Blood claims blood. The drifter spat, his words heavy with pride and bitterness. But the widow stood tall at the doorway, her rifle steady in her hands. Her voice did not waver as she answered, Blood is nothing without honor, and you forfeited both when you left her to die. Her words cut deeper than any bullet, and for a moment, even the men behind him faltered, shifting uneasily in their saddles. The standoff stretched long, the fire of their torches casting grotesque shadows across the cabin's walls. The girl pressed her face into the widow's skirts, whispering, safe now, as though repeating the words could make them true. The widow tightened her grip on the rifle, ready to defend what was hers with every ounce of strength. She knew she was outnumbered, knew the odds were against her, but she also knew the West had a way of remembering acts of defiance. If she fell, she would fall standing, and her story would echo louder than their cruelty ever could. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, shadows moved on the ridge. Figures emerged, silent but steady, the elders of the nearby settlement, drawn by the glow of fire and the echo of voices carried on the wind. They came without haste, their presence commanding without a word. The men with the drifter cursed under their breath, for they knew what it meant. The widow was not standing alone. She had been chosen, honored, and defended by those whose respect was worth more than steel. The drifter's pride cracked then, though he tried to mask it with rage. He shouted threats, spat into the dirt, and pulled his reins as though ready to charge. But his men no longer followed with certainty. Their torches wavered, their horses shifted, and in the heavy silence, it became clear that the widow's defiance, and the weight of the elders at her side, was more than they were willing to fight. The drifter's fury filled the night, but his power had already slipped away, swallowed by the very land he had hoped to claim. The standoff broke into a silence, so heavy it seemed even the prairie held its breath. The widow stood unmoving, the rifle firm in her hands, her shadow flickering in the torchlight. The elders remained behind her, their faces carved with the quiet certainty of people who had seen too many storms to flinch at thunder. The drifter spat curses into the dirt, but the sound rang hollow. He looked to his men, demanding they act, but none moved. Their eyes avoided his, drawn instead to the steady figure of the widow and the child clinging to her skirt. In that moment, they saw not weakness, but unshakable resolve. The little girl lifted her face, her voice trembling but clear enough to pierce the night. "Safe now," she whispered, the same words the widow had given her on that first night. Her small voice carried farther than anyone expected, echoing into the silence like a prayer. The effect was immediate. Even the horses stilled, their restless hooves pausing as though the land itself had heard the child's plea. The widow's heart tightened, tears threatening to break, but her gaze remained fierce. That fragile phrase, spoken by the one who had once been abandoned, had become a declaration stronger than any threat. The drifter's fury turned desperate. He lunged forward a step, his hand twitching near the revolver at his belt. But before steel could clear leather, one of his own men stepped between him and the widow, shaking his head. "This isn't our fight," the man muttered, his voice low but final. Another rider turned his horse and pulled away, the torchlight shrinking as he vanished into the dark. Loyalty, once bound by fear, had fractured under the weight of truth. The drifter, red with rage, realized too late that his men no longer stood with him. The elders, still silent, raised their hands in unison, not in aggression, but in acknowledgement. It was a gesture of respect, not just to the widow, but to the child who had spoken the words that stopped a mob. That act, small yet monumental, sealed their bond in the eyes of those who watched. The drifter could curse, could rage, but no amount of fury could erase what had been witnessed. A child who had once been abandoned had now found her place, defended not just by one woman, but by an entire people. Defeated, but unwilling to admit it, the drifter mounted his horse with a sneer. He spat into the dirt one last time, muttering promises of return, but even he knew his threats rang empty. He rode into the night, his pride shattered, his shadow swallowed by the vast darkness of the prairie. The widow lowered her rifle, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. She pulled the girl into her arms, whispering once more, "You're safe now," this time with tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she believed the words as deeply as the child did. The next morning, the prairie felt different. The air was crisp, the sky wide and endless. But there was a calm that had not been there before. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Townsfolk, once skeptical and cruel in their whispers, now spoke with awe. They had heard how the widow had faced the drifter, how the child had spoken words that silenced grown men, and how the elders themselves had stood beside them. Some called it a miracle, others a sign that even the harshest land could bend before compassion. Whatever the telling, the truth was undeniable. The widow and the child had become a story too strong to be dismissed. The widow carried on with her work, but her steps were lighter, her heart steadier. She no longer feared the shadows on the horizon, for she knew she was not alone. The girl followed her with laughter spilling from her lips, her small feet quick and eager, her eyes bright with trust. The cabin, once a place of sorrow, now rang with joy. Every corner seemed touched by the child's presence, every wall alive with the echoes of her voice. And for the widow, each sound was a reminder that love, once lost, could indeed return in unexpected forms. Yet the greatest change was within the girl. Once timid, broken by abandonment, she now carried herself with a quiet confidence. She no longer asked if she was safe. She knew it. She repeated the widow's words to herself, as if they were a shield, a prayer woven into her very being. And when neighbors passed by, when strangers visited the edge of the land, she stood tall beside the widow, her small hand gripping tightly, her gaze fearless. The girl had found her place, and she would never again be cast aside. The elders continued to visit, never overstaying, but always watching from the distance with respect. They brought gifts for the girl, beads, feathers, and herbs, tokens of honor for the one whose survival had become a symbol. To the widow, these gestures meant more than protection. They meant recognition. She had not simply saved a child. She had carried a legacy forward, transforming grief into strength and loneliness into family. And so, the prairie carried their story. It traveled beyond the town, whispered by travelers, passed along firesides, told in both awe and reverence. It was no longer just the tale of a widow who found an abandoned child. It had become something greater, proof that in the Old West, where cruelty often ruled, compassion could still shape legends. And for the widow and the girl, every dawn that broke across the horizon was a reminder that their bond had been forged not in fear, but in love strong enough to silence the darkest night. As months passed, the story of the widow and the little girl rippled further than the dusty streets of the town. Travelers carried it across the frontier, weaving it into campfire tales told under the stars. Each version grew in detail, but the heart of it remained the same. An abandoned child had been saved, and a widow had stood alone against darkness to protect her. In a land where most names were swallowed by dust, theirs began to endure, not because of power or wealth, but because of the courage to choose love over fear. The drifter never returned. Some said he rode south and drank himself into oblivion. Others claimed he wandered into the desert and was lost to the sands. Whatever the truth, his shadow no longer haunted the widow's nights. Instead, what lingered was the memory of defiance, of the night when fire and fury bowed before compassion. For the widow, it was not triumph she remembered most, but the sound of the girl's voice, trembling yet steady, whispering the words that had turned fear into strength. Safe now. The girl grew, her steps quickening, her voice brighter, her eyes sharper with every passing day. She began to ask questions about the world beyond their cabin, the towns, the riders, the wide horizon. The widow answered patiently, guiding her with both caution and warmth. She knew the frontier was not kind, but she also knew the girl carried within her a strength born of survival. What had begun as fragility had blossomed into resilience, and each day she proved that she was no longer just a child who had been abandoned. She was the daughter of a woman who had chosen her. Neighbors who once doubted now brought gifts of their own, bread, quilts, even seedlings to plant in the soil around the cabin. Though their words were simple, their gestures carried respect. They had seen enough to know that the widow's act had carved something rare into the heart of the West. A reminder that survival without compassion was no survival at all. And though envy lingered in some corners, it was quieter now, softened by the weight of what had been witnessed. The bond between widow and child became unshakable. At night, they would sit together by the fire, the girl's small head resting against the widow's shoulder, their silence speaking louder than words. The widow often thought of her husband, of the grief that had once hollowed her life, and marveled at how fate had returned love to her in the form of a child left for dead. The West had taken much from her, but in giving her this girl, it had also given her something greater than she had ever imagined, a reason to keep going, and a legacy to leave behind. Years later, the girl's laughter still echoed across the prairie, a sound as enduring as the wind through the grass. She had grown into a young woman, steady and sure, her eyes bright with the fire of someone who had known both pain and love. The widow, older now, watched her with pride. The child she had once cradled under the stars was no longer fragile. She was strong, her spirit untamed, a living testament to the promise whispered long ago. Don't cry. You're safe now. The town, once divided in whispers, came to accept the bond they shared. Stories of the drifter's threats and the widow's defiance were told not with mockery, but with reverence. Around saloon tables and at church gatherings, people repeated the tale as a lesson, that in a world where cruelty often ruled, one act of compassion had been enough to silence envy, shame pride, and change the course of two lives. It became part of the town's memory, etched into its identity, like carvings in old wood. Travelers who passed through sought out the cabin at the edge of the land, eager to glimpse the widow and the girl who had once turned away the darkness. They left carrying the story further, letting it stretch across the plains, into mountains, and beyond rivers. Each retelling added new color, but the truth never changed. In the unforgiving heart of the Old West, love had stood taller than fear. The widow, though weathered by years, found peace she had once thought impossible. She no longer feared the horizon, nor the shadows that rode across it. She knew the world could still be cruel, but she also knew that kindness could outlast cruelty when it was fierce enough to fight for. And each time she looked at the girl, now a woman in her own right, she saw proof that her vow had been more than words. It had been destiny. Their story, whispered in towns and carried by winds, endured because it was more than survival. It was about transformation. How grief became love, how abandonment became belonging, and how a whisper in the night became a promise that shaped two lives forever. In the Old West, where most were forgotten, the widow and the girl were remembered, not for power or wealth, but for a single truth, that compassion, even in the harshest of lands, could still write legends. In the end, the tale of the widow and the little girl was never about survival alone. It was about how two broken lives, one scarred by grief, the other by abandonment, came together to create something unshakable. The West was a land that demanded sacrifice, where cruelty often outweighed mercy. Yet in that barren soil, compassion found a way to grow. A whisper spoken under the stars, "Don't cry, you're safe now," became more than comfort. It became a vow strong enough to defy fear, envy, and even death itself. The story reminds us that true strength is not measured in guns or wealth, but in the courage to love when it costs the most. The widow could have turned away, and no one would have blamed her. But by choosing to stay, to protect, and to nurture, she rewrote the girl's destiny and her own. That is the power of choice in the harshest of worlds. One moment of selflessness can echo louder than 1,000 acts of pride. Legends of the Old West often speak of outlaws, gunslingers, and battles carved in blood. But this legend endures because it speaks of something rarer, of kindness that refused to die in a place where everything else seemed to. The widow and the girl prove that compassion is not weakness. It is the kind of strength that can silence mobs, soften hardened hearts, and leave behind a legacy that no storm can erase. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the quietest acts are the ones that thunder through history. Perhaps that is the lesson for us all, that even in our darkest nights, when abandonment or grief threatens to consume us, there remains a choice. We can allow the silence to break us, or we can choose to whisper words of hope strong enough to heal. The widow chose love when the world offered her only sorrow, and in doing so, she became part of a legend that outlasted fear itself. What might change in our own world if we dare to do the same? If this story touched your heart, let it live beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice join the echoes of this tale, and keep these legends alive by subscribing to the channel. And if the widow's whisper made you pause, made you feel, then show it by leaving a like. It may seem small, but just like a single act of compassion, it carries more weight than you imagine.